What I'd like to discuss for you is I'm going to do four things today. I'd like to give you some forecasts on what I think the next year or two might look like, and what we're ahead, and what I believe is ahead. So you can try and have an estimation of how long you might have to be out here for. The second thing I'd like to do is give you my perspective and our perspective as a monetary reformer on what actually needs reforming and how we return to some kind of sustainability. And sustainability means a few things, not just financial sustainability, but some sustainability for what we call a triple bottom line, I guess, people, planet, and profits. I'd also like to share with you some of the consequences of the current system that we actually operate off, and share with you some misperceptions. We've been pitching to Parliament recently, some of the non-profits that we work for. We've been making some tremendous progress at actually getting members of Parliament to understand what we think the core issues are. And what we have actually found is very, very few people know what I think I'm about, what we think the root cause of the issue is, and none of the policies or anything that's happening right now are getting us any closer to some kind of sustainability. The final thing I'd like to do is give you some perspectives on what we think the solutions may be, and the solutions that we're actually pitching to Parliament, to bankers, to anyone that will listen with any kind of influence that can make this actually happen. So is that okay with you? Yeah. Excellent. Okay. I think it's important just to understand, I don't see too many familiar faces. Anyone familiar with me? Anyone watching my videos or been to a presentation? A few of you, okay. Well, I come from a slightly different background to most of you probably. I started a career in the city, and I started as a stockbroker before working on the London Stock Exchange as a trader, before working as an investment banker. And 5 years ago, I quit my job in order to set up a business working with students who are the next generation of investment bankers. And we then started working on banking reform and monetary reform. And around about 2006 is when I went on a roadshow across 200 different universities, giving my perspective on the terrible crash ahead. And we believe the primary cause of that is some economic theories which are completely out of date and have no touch with reality. So it was pretty hard then, but then the financial crisis came to be, and we got a lot more attention. And recently we've been having massive progress. Now, the one thing that I can do that helps me to make sense of the disgusting things that are happening in the world right now is that I see every time we have a new announcement of Greece going bankrupt, or every time we hear about Italian debt, or next Portuguese debt and Irish debt and French debt and English debt, which are all about to have a downgrade as far as I'm concerned over the next year or so, is to actually, every time we get an announcement like that, I think we're getting one step closer to some kind of sustainability and real reform. And for me, that's the only way that I can actually make sense of this, because there's some really, really disgusting things happening in this world right now. And that's all as a result, as I'd like to present to you today, due to our monetary system and how it's actually structured. So that's my background. I'd like to share with you first, and I'll try and compete with the bells and we'll see what happens, but I can go pretty loud if I need to. A path to what I believe reform will actually look like, and what I think the next 2 years will look like. So firstly, as an ex-trader, I can't help but analyze markets. I can't help but look at charts and have some kind of forecasts. What I'm forecasting right now is that we're going to have a downward market for the rest of this year, and towards the end of the year we're going to have a regulation-based spike, where everyone's going to forget that they can't afford property and forget that they're maxed out on their credit cards, and the regulations are going to push one more rally in the market. That's what we call it. And from then, that is going to be the final one. We're going to have some, what I believe to be the main and final crash. I just wrote a book called Bank to the Future, Protect Your Future Before Governments Go Bust. I'm forecasting a complete bankruptcy of the governmental system due to our monetary and banking system. So the way that I'm forecasting that will look like. Now, recently I posted, well, quite a while ago, I posted a video on YouTube called The Great Depression of 2013. And in the Great Depression of 2013, I forecasted the following path of what might happen. The very first thing I forecasted was that we're going to get credit rating downgrades. For those of you that are from a non-financial background, essentially a credit rating downgrade of a country just means that people are no longer comfortable lending money to that government. And every single country, with the exception of a few, is 100% reliant upon lending to the government. And so when the credit ratings get downgraded, that's the first signal that people are not confident in the lending to government market. So I forecasted that. Then we had the American downgrade by S&P. Then we had the Italian and the Greek as well. And now we're having the French, we believe, about to get downgraded. I believe next will be Portugal and then Ireland, and I think we're going to have one in the UK as well. The UK seem to think they're pretty invincible right now, but we all operate off the same Ponzi scheme that we call our monetary system. So it's only a question of time till every country gets downgraded and those IOU pieces of paper become absolutely worthless that we call government debt. So that's the first thing that we're going to see. Now, with every credit rating downgrade, we're going to have a reaction from the market, and the market's going to get more fearful, and that's going to put out a fear amongst everybody in the economy. So the next thing that comes from that is when people are all trying to pay off their debt, due to the way our monetary system is structured, if anyone in this room pays off your debt, you've just actually decreased the total amount of money in circulation in our economy, which means that if all of us pay off our debt, we'd actually have no money in our economy, apart from a very few coins and cash, which make up about 3% of our money supply right now. So that's why the government are so insistent upon getting the credit markets moving again, because they know that money is debt. Well, they don't know that money is debt, but they know that the economy actually relies upon money being debt. So the fact that no one can pay off their debt without having a reduction in the total amount of money in our economy. So the fact that no one's ever going to be paying off this debt, and if everyone in this room, or everyone in the whole economy rather, paid off their debt, we'd actually have no money in the economy and we'd still owe the banks a lot of money. Because in fact, if you look at our economy right now, we actually have more debt than money, which is a mathematical impossibility. So we're running a Ponzi scheme essentially, and that's the economy that we're actually running right now. And we're trying to keep this Ponzi scheme alive a little bit longer by patching it up, patching it up, patching it up. And what's happening right now is people are blaming the symptoms of the greater disease right now. Symptoms are greedy bankers. Symptoms are more debt. Symptoms are capitalism failing. These are all symptoms, but they're not actually the causes. The causes, I believe, and what I'd like to lay the case for today, is the way our monetary system is actually structured. So the next thing that comes from credit rating downgrades is, in order to, because no one really wants to lend to the government anymore, because you're all maxed out on your credit cards and mortgages in general, because every single company is operating off a place of insolvency because of the financial markets, and because the government is absolutely maxed out, hence the reason why they're getting downgraded in the first place, because they're trying to support a welfare state which cannot be supported because they don't actually have the control over our money supply. The only thing they can do next is turn to our central bank, and our central bank is called quantitative easing, which is pushing the Ponzi scheme a little bit further. So what you're going to see next is lots and lots of quantitative easing by the European Central Bank, but what quantitative easing is doing is it's essentially just refinancing the economy for a little bit longer. While you hear these things like IMF bailouts and European Central Bank bailouts, no one's actually really bailing out. They're just lending more money. And that money all has to be repaid, plus interest, in a Ponzi scheme where there's not enough money to pay off the debt. The third step that we're going to see is, as with all the quantitative easing, where essentially the central banks are propping up a system that can't sustain itself, we're going to see regulatory changes. And we've already seen this with things like Basel III. So the next thing we're going to see with the regulatory change is we're going to ask our banks to increase their reserves, and we've already seen that. Now, here's the thing. In the UK, we actually have virtually zero requirement on reserves at the banks. They're 100% unregulated. Maybe you may have seen a video, or you may have seen a theory called fractional reserve banking. Anyone heard of fractional reserve banking? Well, fractional reserve banking is essentially a system whereby banks actually create our nation's money supply by being able to lend money that they actually create as brand new money. So when you actually go and take out a mortgage, that's not somebody else's savings. Please do not think that banks are these intermediaries that lend between people who have savings and people who need money, because that's not the case at all. That is what is taught at university, and that is exactly what I was taught at university in my economics background. Check. Okay. And economics, what they're teaching our kids at university is completely inaccurate. We'll get there in the end if you just bear with it. And so, yeah, so what we're going to then see is that we're going to ask our banks to increase their reserves. Now, what that actually means is that they're asking them to hold more money with their central bank. So each and every bank, HSBC, RBS, all the different banks, they have an account with the Bank of England in the case of the UK. And they are required to hold... Okay, I'm just going to shout now. I'll just lose my voice to the end. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah. Okay. Well, they're required to hold a certain amount of cash or number money, digital money. Very few cash actually exists anymore with the central bank. And the theory is that if they actually hold more cash, then that will actually create some kind of sustainability in our banking system. The theory is completely flawed, it's completely wrong. What does actually happen is we rely on our banks for the creation of money. Every single time you take out a mortgage, that is a lifeblood of our economy. Every time you take out a credit card, every time you take on any kind of debt, that is exactly the lifeblood of our economy due to the way our monetary system is structured. So therefore, when we're asking people to increase reserves and kind of decrease the lending, we're having conflicting policies. At one moment, we got David Cameron coming along and saying to us, please, for the sake of the economy, will you pay off your credit cards? What he is saying is, I would like a depression, please, because I'd like to eliminate all our money because the credit cards are our money. And that's the way our monetary system is structured. At the very same time, they're saying, please, banks, lend some more money. And at the very same time, they're putting in regulatory effects in order to increase the reserves, to decrease the amount of lending that's going on. So which one do we actually want? That is why economists, politicians, and bankers collectively cannot figure out how to get out of this economy, because economists refuse to look at the way the money is actually created. And that's a big part of our problem. So what we're going to see, sorry? Their theories, I could go into that, but their theories have completely ignored creation of money in 100 years of theories that they've actually created. They assume that banks are an intermediary and that money is not actually created as debt. They have a theory which I don't necessarily want to go into right now, but I could give you more details on that afterwards. But the theory is completely flawed, and all you need to do is look at that. So when I speak to economists and I present at universities, they call us crackpots, essentially, but no economist has ever confronted me and said, what you're saying is wrong. They've never said that. And I've spoken to a lot of economists out there. So the next effect is they're going to ask to increase reserves. Here's what increased reserves will do. It will cause the next depression. Because we rely on banks for the creation of money, we're therefore going to see a lot less money in our economy. We saw this in the Great Depression last time in the 1930s. Where we had a massive decrease in the money supply. Now, all that is going to do as well is the banks, and you'll see this, and corporations, as they're hard for cash right now, and as they're looking to find more reserves in order to meet reserve requirements, they're just going to lay off staff. And all they're going to do is replace staff with computers, and we're going to end up in this whole system where everyone's trying to be more and more efficient, so it's going to lead to massive unemployment. That's the next effect. So when the central banks and the regulators require increased reserves, the net effect is a decrease in the money supply, a trigger of a depression, and massive unemployment. And that's what they're pushing for right now. So the next step that we're going to see from that is, and Now, if everyone's losing their jobs, what are we going to do to survive? Well, either we're going to move out to the country and try and figure out how to boycott the system altogether, which I'm sure a lot of you are actually opting for right now because it's quite a good option to me. Looks pretty attractive. But most people are going to go for more debt. And that more debt is all that's going to stimulate the economy. But everyone's maxed out. Everyone can't afford their credit cards right now. They couldn't afford the mortgage in the first place. So all of the policy is designed at increasing debt because debt is money. And that's all that will keep the economy alive. So the next thing that we're going to see is all those people that took on the extra debt because they're unemployed, they're all going to default on their debt. They're going to remember that they couldn't afford to pay their mortgage. They're going to remember that we're only relying on interest rates being zero because the bankers are dictating policy right now. And they're going to remember that they can't actually afford any of that in the first place. So we have not solved anything since the last time the credit markets actually went to halt. So all we're doing is keeping the Ponzi scheme alive a little bit longer. And then we're going to see the credit squeeze again. And that's when banks stop lending to each other. And because all money is debt, that's a real big problem. Now, for those of you that thinks we should have let the banks go bust, if you let a bank go bust, you're going to have a massive burden on the government because they guarantee all the deposits on the bank. And secondly, you're going to have this massive depression as a massive chunk of our money gets taken out of the economy. So at the moment, you cannot let a bank go bust. You simply can't. It will cause an absolute depression. But if you want them to continue, we have to perpetually rely on more debt in order to increase the Ponzi scheme for a little bit longer, which means that whatever we do, we can't solve this problem. But what's the short-term solution? The short-term solution is to increase debt. So politicians elect for the short-term solution and try and keep the system a little bit alive a little bit longer. And that's all the regulators, the central bankers, the bankers, and the politicians, and the bankers which are dictating policy with the politicians are actually doing right now. So the next thing is you're going to see that credit squeeze, and that is going to be a disastrous one. The only reason that we got out of the last credit squeeze is because of the quantitative easing, which is completely unsustainable. Are you all with me at the moment, or am I speaking a little bit too financial, technical, jargony? See, the problem is that when you've worked as an economist, a banker, you tend to pick up a stupid amount of jargon because there should not be this amount of jargon in the financial industry, but it's absolutely ridiculous for the average person to understand. Not only the average person to understand, the politicians to understand, because all my experience tells me that politicians don't actually understand how money is created. There's 600 members of parliament in the UK, and in my experience, there's only 4 of them that have an actual understanding of how money's created. So the thing about this whole conspiracy theory, if anyone thinks that there's some kind of deliberate conspiracy theory, I find that a bit implausible. I think it's completely misunderstanding and ignorance that we're playing with right now. And it all comes and all stems from economic theories which were completely incorrect in the first place. And then the final step that we'll actually have is when we have the credit squeeze, we're going to be in a scenario where we either choose a depression by allowing the banks to go bust, or we choose to bail them out. Now, do you think the public, me, you, and all the people outside Occupy Wall Street and Occupy London are going to be happy with another bailout? It's different this time because people understand what a bailout is. We have got record high levels of financial literacy right now because everybody has taken an interest. If it's suicide not to understand finance right now. So everybody's taken an interest in this right now. So the next bailout, which is inevitable, predictable, and guaranteed, is going to be a time when we're actually going to decide, are we going to allow the government to bail out, or are we going to let the government go bust? And that's our decision really at the moment. Because they have actually, all we're doing is we're taking all the debt from our credit cards, our mortgages, all the debt from our corporations and companies that all rely on capital markets and refinancing of debt to continually grow. And we're replacing that with government debt as we take essentially through the bailout system and governments taking on increased debt. But we're in a system where there's more debt than money, so there's no way out without some kind of reform. So the system that we're going to be in next, that's the next option. We're just going to be thinking, do we want to bail out or do we want to let the governments go bust? And that's our scenario that we're in right now. So here's the beauty of all this. At the end of all that, there has to be reform. It's inevitable, it's predictable, and it's guaranteed. But here's the thing. None of us agree on what the reform should actually be. And nor do any of the governments, nor do the politicians, nor do the bankers. So we believe that there's a monetary problem. And I'd like to make the case for you to at least understand and see if you buy this theory that it's a monetary problem or not. So there's my forecast of what the next 2 years. If you'd like me to put some timelines on it, from looking at the charts, I think you're going to see one more boom, one more regulatory boom, where all the central bankers, the bankers and the politicians and the economists get together and cook up some crazy bailout plan, which will leave a rally in the markets, and then that will lead to more people taking on mortgages and trying to buy their houses again, and more credit cards. And then round about 2013, everyone's going to realize that they're maxed out again, and that's when we're going to see depression followed by reform. And I think that there's more of an appetite for reform than ever before. So the beauty of what's coming out of this is everyone has their role. Everyone has their role. Everybody that's here right now, this is important stuff that you're doing. What all the other people are doing, it's the accumulation of getting people to listen and take notice is really, really important. But the next thing, the one criticism that I've heard, I guess I'm in a bit of a unique situation where I do have many banker friends. I do have access to politicians, and I work in the business environment as well. The criticism that I hear from the outside, and that you probably have heard and you're probably aware of, is that no one really knows what they're asking for here because everyone's disagreeing on what they're asking. So there needs to be some kind of clarity, and that's a perception from the outside. Whether that's true or not is you guys know, but that's a perception from the outside. So what needs to reform? I'd like to give you a perspective, an opinion, and what I'm going to spend the rest of my life dying trying to make happen.
Don't die.
I'll try. There's three things that we think are the primary problems in sustainability in every economy that operates off a banking system. And this system started in the UK. We're the founders of the Ponzi scheme, by the way. Americans copied it a lot later, and then it was operated all around the world as everyone copied our Ponzi scheme that we created in the UK. All over there in the Bank of England, yeah. So there's three things that happen today that we think need to change. The first is as follows. When you deposit your money with a bank, and this comes from, has anyone heard of Positive Money? Positive Money is an institution that we endorse, we promote, and they've actually drafted legislation which they're introducing into Parliament at the moment and pitching to politicians that might be able to push that forward. They've got actual drafted legislation of how to transition our economy into sustainability. The first thing is that when you deposit your money at a bank, the bank becomes the legal owner of your money. So when you think that that's your money, they're simply numbers, which is actually, in fact, when you look at the system, is somebody else's debt. The balance in your bank account right now is simply somebody else's debt. That's all it is. And the bank is the legal owner of that debt. They have a promise, it's a promissory note that they will give you that money back. That's all it is. But they're the legal owner of your money when you deposit it at a bank. That's the first thing. The second thing is that when they become the legal owner of your money, or what is somebody else's debt, because every penny created in a bank is simply somebody else's debt that needs to be repaid plus interest. The second thing is that banks decide how they're going to spend that money. Now, because 97% of our money is created in this way, banks are actually the people that decide where money's being spent. If they think it's good to spend on speculation, then they can spend that money on speculation. If they think that it's good to spend that money on creating weapons of mass destruction, then they can spend that money on creating weapons of mass destruction. If they don't think it's right to invest in the environmental crisis, then they don't need to invest in the environmental crisis. The only time they will invest in the environmental crisis is when the environmental crisis figures out a way of making profit out of the environmental crisis. So what we have right now is a money supply that's completely created by banks, And they are dictating exactly what that money is spent. How much of that money do you think goes into the productive economy? By productive, I mean somebody actually doing something like this, trying to raise money to make a cause happen, a movement happen. Somebody trying to create a business in order to offer more value in their community. How much do you think of that money gets taken to the productive economy? Less than 10%. In fact, 8%. 8% of money goes to the productive economy. If you go into a bank right now and you say, I've got this brilliant idea for a business, it's going to add so much value to our community, and it's going to be a brilliant business, will they lend you the money right now? No, but if you had a credit rating and you went in, the exact same person, and you went to the bank and you said, I need to redecorate my house and I need 10 grand. If you've got a credit rating, will they give you the money? Yes, they will, because they favor that. And where do you think most of the money goes? It goes into property. Why is property so unaffordable? Because the banks create money secured by property. So all we have done is all this money creation has fueled a complete and utter diabolical property speculation, which now needs to be corrected by about 40% because they're just completely crazy prices right now. And all of that is because of the monetary system. So we think that there's two flaws. Firstly, the banks become the legal owner of your money when you deposit it at a bank. Secondly, banks decide how they spend that money. The third flaw is the biggest of them all, and that is that banks create money, as I've already laid the case for already. If you want to know how banks create money, you may have watched a theory that states that they have to hold 10% of their money in reserve, and then they lend out the remaining 90%, and that money gets deposited into another bank, and that bank then they hold 10% of that money and 90% gets lent out, and we have this what's called a multiplier effect in economics, where eventually you have what they say in the theory that you have about, you have £10 for every pound created. £9 is created by a bank. That was a nice theory, but that doesn't exist anymore. Banks simply create as much money as they are willing to lend. And that's it. That is how we determine our money supply. The money supply, the lifeblood of our economy, is completely determined by how many of you are willing to borrow and willing to repay. That's it. That changed around about the 1980s with the Thatcher reforms in banking. In America, they still operate off a fractional reserve. But sorry if I go a bit complicated for a second, you can switch off because it's not that important. You can trust me or you can go through it. But that has been completely loopholed because rather than holding reserves, they can hold assets of reserves, and those assets are created as debt. And those were assets that were originally created in the banking system. So there is no reserve. Why do you think Goldman Sachs, before the financial crisis, who was meant to be, if the rules were implemented, leveraged 10 to 1, they were leveraged 365 to 1. That's how much money was being created through the shadow banking, derivatives markets, and all sorts of crazy stuff. All of these financial innovations, which nobody understands, and I've been working on this for 10 years and I still get complexed by some of them. But all of these financial innovations were simply a symptom of the fact that banks create money, and we have an economy that perpetually relies on more money creation in order to have growth. More money creation means more debt. So all of these innovations were ways of getting more innovative with the Ponzi scheme, but don't think it's the banks that can make the change, because all they're doing is perpetuating the system that they're allowed to perpetuate. The change can only happen when the government says, banks, you're not allowed to create money, and we've got an alternative system in order to create money, which we've already had. Did you have a question, or should we take questions at the end? Check? Okay. Don't worry, I'll go till it all goes, till the voice goes. So those are the three things that we believe need to change. Until we change those three things, we're not going to have sustainability. We're going to have a depression, we're going to have a crash, and out of that depression and crash, there's going to be some interesting questions asked. And that's when we believe we're going to have the reforms that we need to create some kind of sustainability. Now, the sustainability with how that money is spent has to come from people understanding what happens with their money when it's deposited with a bank. So we have reforms to implement that as well, because there's monetary sustainability, taking away the fact that money is created as debt, and then there's what that money is actually spent on. Check. Check, check. Okay. Okay, so that's what the first thing I did is I went through the forecast. The second thing is what I think the main problems are. I'd like to go through some of the consequences of having a system where banks create almost all of our money as debt. The consequences are as follows. Here's the rules of our economy. Here is the rules. Why do you think politicians, bankers, and central bankers and economists find it so hard to create some kind of sustainability? Why do we have boom and bust continually? The reason is because here's the rules. If you would like more money in our economy to stimulate any kind of growth, you have to have more debt. It's the only way. If you want more money on our current monetary system and our current rules, you have to have more debt. So the last few years and decades have just been about the government implementing policies where the banks can create more money as debt. Hence why we had Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and all these institutions that were designed everybody needs to own their own home. Nobody owns their own home. They borrow the money and the bank owns it. So those are the rules. More money equals more debt. That's the first rule. The second rule of our current economy is as follows. If you want less debt because you think everyone's got too much debt, then you have to have less money. And that's it. That's the rules. So what have we been doing? We have been creating crazy innovations like trying to indirectly control the level of credit that banks actually create by manipulating interest rates in an econometric formula that was invented in universities that simply cannot win. We have this crazy system. The mind boggles at how crazy our system is. And that's why no one gets it. Because it is bloody hard to understand. But I hope I'm making it a little bit more simple. So those are the rules. Now here's the consequences of the system. Every single pound in circulation, with the exception of a little bit of money that's created at the Bank of England, has to be matched with a pound of debt. Every single pound in circulation has to be met with a pound of debt. Every pound of debt has to be repaid as a higher amount of money because there's interest incurred on that debt. So therefore, the consequences are that we have to perpetuate debt. We're in this system whereby it's a game of who can use debt in order to make some kind of margin in a business at the expense of someone else that's in debt. And the crazy situation is that now we have more debt than money, so therefore we're in a system which we cannot win. We can only redistribute income from the poor to the rich that understand finance. That's the only way this economy can go. The second consequence is that we have a property boom where property has become a speculation tool for banks. And we're told by the government and by everyone that we must own our own home. And we have policies to make sure that we all own our own home. And we have property courses across the world telling us how to use debt in order to buy properties and leverage it with no money down and all sorts of stuff. Where no one's actually, it's completely taken away. You have to be a genius in business now just to be able to own your own home outright. It's not a possibility for many people at all. So the consequences, we have this property-led boom. Why? Because the easiest way of getting people in debt is to secure it as an asset which won't move and won't run away. So if you default on your debt, we can have your property. Okay? Now, fair enough. If I was lending my money, I'd probably want some kind of security. But that's assuming that it's my money in the first place. This money is created out of thin air. It wasn't their money in the first place. So we're in this system where the government have actually given away the money power. The last time we had the money power was in the 1844 reforms, where the Conservative government wrote an act called the Bank Charter Act. And in that Bank Charter Act, they said, we realize that banks are creating money, we must have a monopoly on the creation of money. And they took away the power to create money from the banks because they recognized exactly what's happening now was about to happen when they had the depression, sorry, not the depression, but the speculation bubble in 1844 followed by the crash. And so what they did is they said banks can't create money anymore, but there was a fatal flaw. The flaw was that they didn't know that money was going to be digital and computer in the future. They just said you can't create bank notes, paper money. So now the power to create electronic money, which is the entire money supply, 97% of it, is in private hands. We have a private money supply. That's what we have right now, a completely private money supply. The money creation power is owned by banks. Hence the reason why we have a property boom. The third consequence is that we can only have a redistribution from those who understand speculation away from the productive economy to those who are geniuses in the financial markets. And that is the redistribution that we're having right now. We're having a redistribution away from everywhere in the UK where banks are creating money through their retail banking. Do you think any of the people sat in a bank know they're creating money when they're issuing a loan? Of course not, but if they don't issue a loan, they're going to get sacked. And that's the incentive structure that we have in the banking system right now. The favor is always create more money, create more money, create more loans, create more loans. So all this does is it redistributes from everywhere in the UK to the City of London just over there because they tend to get paid a lot more than a retail banker in Norwich. Okay? So we have this redistribution. It gets worse. Due to the way that the IMF and World Bank is structured, we're redistributing money as every country is operating, pretty much every country, off the same system. We are all plagued by a lack of money in our system. Therefore, we continually need to get some debt-free money from another currency, and that tends to be the developing countries that we go, sorry, the developing countries that we go to. So we're redistributing money from the developing countries to the developed countries because we tend to have more strength in order to do that. It's redistributing in every sense of the word when you have more debt than money. The next consequence is because banks actually are the legal owner of your money, they dictate where that is spent. So therefore, policy is dictated by bankers. It's completely dictated by bankers. If you want your student fees paid and you're some students rioting outside in order to get your student fees paid, there's not enough tax for that. That just covers the interest. They have to borrow that money, and they have to borrow that money through the financial markets. In order to borrow that, they need to get permission from essentially the bankers and the banking system. There's a few loops missed out of that hole, but that's essentially what it happens. So if you want any money for any social cause, you can't have it under the current system unless you can persuade a bank to lend you money. And banks will only lend you money if you have a good credit rating and there's profit in it. And quite right as well, if banks were operating the way they should operate, I believe that they should have some kind of social impact in their credit rating as well. But if it's their money, it's their money. But the problem is that it's not their money. If banks were just lending savers money, we could let them go bankrupt. Screw them. But we can't right now because that's how our system is. The next thing we will have is we will have boom and bust forever. Here's what boom and bust is. Boom and bust is simply, we're in a bust right now. Let's implement some kind of policy to get the banks lending again. The banks get lending again. When they get lending in, how do we do that? How do we get the banks lending again? Anyone know? Lowering interest rates. What are we doing when we're lowering interest rates? We're making the cost of borrowing cheaper so that everyone will lend again. So if you all go and take out a loan right now, by the way, you're a hero because you're saving our economy. If you can take on a mortgage right now, you're saving our economy. If you can take on a credit card right now, you are saving our economy. Because you're creating more money by taking that on. So we get out of this, but normally we start going into this boom market where everyone's borrowing, more money's being created, the money's expanding. Then what happens? This bogey comes along called inflation, where all the prices are going up and no one can afford it. So what do the economists say that you should do when you have inflation? You should raise interest rates. Why? Why should you raise interest? Think about this from a humanistic perspective. What are we doing? We're trying to say the prices are going up too much. We need to send someone bankrupt. And so they're increasing interest rates. Why? Because what they're actually doing is they're taking all you lot who have taken on debt and they're saying, thank you for saving our economy. Now we got inflation, we must get those prices down, and the way we're going to do that is we're going to make your debt unaffordable by increasing interest rates. We're going to send you bankrupt. And that's how we turn our economy around. And we enter boom, bust, boom, bust, boom, bust. In this cycle where and every bust, what happens? The national debt increases because the government step in order to meet the fact that all the individuals and all the companies are maxed out on their overdraft. What's different now? The government are maxed out and we all know it. And we're asking them to spend more. Why? Because there's huge environmental issues, there's huge social issues. They must pay for my education. And all we're doing is we're asking them to perpetuate the system a little bit longer. It's a Ponzi scheme. Poverty is, I'll take questions at the end. Poverty is guaranteed in this system. It's guaranteed. Somebody has to lose. In order for you to have money in your bank, somebody else has to be in debt. Now, most rich people, they take on debt because they understand finance in order to speculate on property or commodities or whatever it may be. And by the way, we're all contributing to the system. If anyone has a pension, they're contributing to the system. The banks are public companies. Who invest in public companies? Our pensions. Who owns the pensions? You probably do. Some of you may not have one. So we are the banks. We're killing ourselves here. That's how absurd this system is. Poverty is completely guaranteed in the system where there's less money than debt. And it will increase forever. If anyone thinks that we need some funding, and yes, we certainly do, for the environmental crisis, you will not get your funding until you sort out the money issue. It's all wasted effort. The money will not come. The money cannot come because money is created from a bank. If you want the money for the environmental crisis, you better have a good credit rating and you better figure out how to make it a profitable model. Because that's the only way of getting the money to solve that environmental crisis. Everybody's wasting their time. The only way to get the money is to solve the money issue. This is why we feel that the money issue is at the root of every issue here. Everybody right now, if you have no debt, if you have no credit cards, if you do not have a mortgage, you owe £35,000. That's your share of the national debt. If you're about to have a child, that's their share of the national debt. That money is redistributed to bankers. That's what the system does every time we bail out. And don't think that we can't bail out the banks, because that's not the answer. That's a depression for us all if we don't bail out the banks. It's simply the way the economy is structured. So essentially, I'm sorry if this sounds pretty bad and I might get booed off the stage at this side, but all the financial innovation has simply kept the system alive. The bankers are the heroes right now. I'm sorry, I didn't mean it like that. But you understand what I'm trying to say here right now. They're keeping the system alive. I think it's awful what they're doing. I think the banking system is the most corrupt system out there. However, we have to have more debt. And that's why it's a monetary problem. It's not a banker's problem.
It's not a problem for them though, is it?
It's not a problem for them because they're going to walk away when this all collapses. But when the whole banking system collapses, which is a guaranteed result of this, there's going to be some losers there. But they probably would have got their money because they're on super high wages. Because guess what? Creating money is a pretty profitable business. So therefore, banks are dictating policy. Why do you think interest rates are at 0% right now, or virtually 0%? Because that's the only way they can keep the system alive. The bankers are saying, if you put up interest rates, you're going to screw the whole economy. Do you know what disaster it is if you put the interest rate? And they're right. So who's dictating policy here? The banks decide where the money's being spent, The banks decide what the interest rates are. They're dictating policy. So the only reason, and here's the funny thing, the government could achieve all of their goals if they reformed money. They could achieve most, I mean, let's not be crazy here. We're not going to live in, a world of no issues. But they can solve a lot of their issues if they do that. And it's been done before. This is not radical. This is not crazy. It's been done many times before. Before the last 40 years, you used to have massive debate about who should control money. Since economics since economics went into university, they've just taken it as given. Economics has never proved their theories. No one agrees on economics, but it's dictating policy. I spent 4 years studying economics, mathematical formulas, just to pass exams. I didn't get what any of it was. By the end of it, I started to understand, and it took me 4 years of getting out of university just to understand what 4 years I mathematically proved in order to pass my exams. And that's what we're dictating policy for at the moment. Tax will increase forever under the current system. If anybody wants to move to a system where the government owns everything, keep this system. Stop rioting right now, because tax is going to 100%. We're going to have to give all our money to the government. If you want that, then keep this system. Stop rioting. Stop protesting. Because tax can only increase under the current system, because each and every bailout, which has to happen, the national debt increases on every bust, and every bust has to happen because banks create money and we have more money than debt. Another consequence is that we have to gamble with interest rates. So as I said earlier, we have this cycle where we're trying to dictate indirectly how much money banks create by controlling interest rates. It's an ineffective tool. It cannot work in the current system. The system has broken down. It is broken right now. There is never, ever, ever, has anyone ever tried paying off their debt and solving their debt issues by taking on more debt? Has anyone ever tried that one? And did it work?
No, he lost his business and his apartment was paid.
It always ends that way. That's what the government are doing. It will end that way. You cannot solve a debt problem by taking on more debt. It's impossible. It doesn't work. Let's get simple, for Christ's sake. We've got so complicated in finance. Can't we just get simple here? Inflation is guaranteed into the system as well. So we wrote the Positive Money and the people that we're promoting, the not-for-profit we're promoting, that's drafted legislation in order to get out of this system. They wrote a letter to Mervyn King, and Mervyn King said his response. They've got a good letter, but another quote from Mervyn King: "Of all the banking systems that we could currently have, the worst is the one that we have right now." And I completely agree. And Mervyn King understands these issues. He told us. He understands the theories of 100% money and fractional reserve banking. He gets it. Not many other people do. Okay? So finally, just before I end, sorry if I ranted a bit, but I get a bit excited about these things. The reason I get excited is because it may sound like there's a lot of negativity ahead, but we've reached the pinnacle, the end of the system. This is the time for reform. These reforms can happen, will happen, they're guaranteed to happen, and the world will be a lot better when we do have them. Here's the solutions that we're actually proposing. Now, it might get a little bit technical, because unfortunately we're in a technical environment with finance. But most important, one of the important things that we need to do is we need to separate money deposited in a bank from money invested. We need to separate that. Essentially, the Vickers report, when he talked about ring fencing, was a version of that won't work. It's not quite good enough, because it still relies on the whole money creation system, and that is not going to solve the problem on its own. None of the regulations that are being proposed right now are going to solve this problem. They're going to patch it up a little bit longer. They're not going to solve the problem. So we need to separate that money. When you deposit your money in a bank, they should have to ask your permission to use that money. You shouldn't receive interest on it, because all it is a safe place for your money. So they should ask your permission, and you should be the legal owner of that money. And if they want to use that money, they then should take that money from a current account and move it across to an investment account. And those investment accounts should have very clear policies of what the money is being used for. So you can decide where you would like that money used. If we have an investment account which is purely investing in the environmental crisis, then you can decide to move that money there. If you want to invest in weapons of mass destruction, and some people will, it won't be eliminated. Some people will, but you should know that that's what's happening with your money, and you should know and take full consequences of what's happening with your money in an investment account. What the effect of that has is it means that where money is allocated in the economy is a reflection of society's values of what they want their money to be used for. It also means that if that money in current account was not being used to speculate and leverage and create money, it means that we would not need a government bailout. It means that we would not need a Bank of England guarantee on that money. It means that if the bank makes stupid mistakes with that money, they can go bust, and your money is still safe because it's off their balance sheet. What that essentially means is it's not their money. It's your money. And if they go bust, your money's still there. But if you put it into an investment account, you accept and joint risk with the bank. You are receiving returns for risk. And you're taking risk with that money, but you decide that you're taking risk with that money, and you decide with the bank where that money actually gets allocated, and you know what's happening to it. Now here's the problem. Banks create money as debt, so on its own, that's not going to solve the problem. You must separate who controls and creates money from who spends it. You have to separate them. There's too much conflicts of interest. If you had the ability to create money, you would dictate where that money goes, whatever's important to you. If you believe that profits are important, you'd put it in profits. If you believe that the environmental crisis is more important, you'd put it there. But if you had the power to create money, you would decide what happens with that money. We need to separate the decision between who creates money and how it's spent. History has proven that banks cannot be in charge of how that money is spent. It's unsustainable. It can't be sustained. It can't be created as debt. History has proven that politicians, if a load of students are burning your building because you've said that we need the money in order to pay for their student fees, the incentives to create more money for political reasons because you're about to be re-elected is far too great. Politicians cannot dictate how much money is created because they're also the people that are going to be spending it. You need to separate those decisions. The proposals that we have is that we make that decision completely independent. So banks would need to repay all the money that they have created as debt since 1844. They have created 2.1 trillion. That would need to be repaid gradually as people pay off their debt over a 20-year period. We have a transition period. So the banks would need to repay all the money that's created as debt. I'll go through, allow me to finish. Okay. The other thing is, now that banks do not have the ability to create money because we've made it completely illegal, we need to create money some other way. We cannot create money as debt because then we end in the perpetual Ponzi scheme. So we need to create money debt-free. Now we believe that the only people that can dictate how much money we create is people that only have one goal. And their goal is to create sustainability in the markets. Their sustainability in the price levels. Their goal is to control inflation and deflation. And they will have set goals. And all they do is they say, right, here's the inflation this month or this quarter. This is how much money we need to create in order to prevent it. So they simply type in their computer the amount of money that needs to be created or destroyed, and then they deposit that to the Treasury. The Treasury, through a democratic process, decides how that money is spent. What we have done is we have taken away banks' ability to create money. We have taken away the Ponzi scheme that the money's created as debt. And we have returned that the values of society will reflect where money actually goes. Those decisions have to be separated, and we've also separated the Zimbabwe and Germany situation where we can have hyperinflation for political reasons to fund a war. Now, we believe that there has to be a monetary policy committee, independent of banks, independent of government, but they need to answer to the Treasury, and their meetings need to be, they need to answer to Parliament, and their meetings need to be recorded every 3 months. Now, here's the thing. You may say, don't they do that now? No, they don't. They set interest rates in a system that no one understands, saying, oh, right, well, we've got M1 money supply, coins and cash. M4 is deposits and bond and all these crazy things that no one understands. And they're trying to indirectly control how much money banks create by putting interest rates up and down and sending people in a depression, boom and bust cycle. All they would need to do is say, here's the money supply. We need some more. The population's growing. I'm not telling them how they should do that. They'll be experts on how to do that. But their goal is simply inflation and deflation. We return to sustainability within the economy. Is it going to solve all our issues? Of course it's not going to solve all our issues. But it's going to solve a lot of them, and there'll be more reforms to follow. We believe this is very simply done. We have done all the calculations. We have showed them how it can be achieved. They just have to decide how to do it. Now, do banks want that? Of course they don't want that. Will there be some disruption? Yes, there will. But if you've been taking heroin for the last 10 years, do we say, let's not come off heroin because it might be nasty? It's going to be hard. There's going to be some issues. There's going to be some losers in that game. There certainly is. But the banks will be the main losers, I can tell you that. They'll probably go away. They'll probably retire. Yeah, so what? Put some new bankers in. Anyway, that's our proposals. We need to separate those two things. We believe until you separate those two things, you will never be able to solve any of these issues. We believe that until those two things are separating, no amount of going angry at bankers, no amount of getting angry at hedge funds, no amount of regulation to patch up a system that's no longer going to work, no amount of any of that is going to solve the problem, and that's all we're focusing on right now. So we can get angry at bankers, or we can show the government that there are alternatives and that that we have a privatized money supply, and they still believe that money is created at the Bank of England. They still believe that. Because I've spoken to a lot of members of Parliament, and they don't understand. We drafted Positive Money, got in front of the Independent Commission on Banking, and pitched this. They thought it was too extreme. So we had the Vickers report instead, patching up the system. The Vickers report will help. It certainly will help. It won't work, though. It definitely won't work. So what I wanted to end with, is somebody else speaking? Have I gone over time? I completely ranted. Or... Okay, so just chuck me off when we're done, yeah? Okay. I'd like to share some of the things that I'm doing and my individual approach, and I think what everyone is doing is important. I think if everyone could take some kind of responsibility in their unique way. I happen to be a business person, so therefore business is my forum for making a difference. What you're doing is really, really important. It's the collective power of all people understanding where they play their part to get this message out there of what can actually be done, and we need to offer solutions. Getting angry on its own is unproductive. Offering solutions is productive. It does have a part. We're getting attention right now because of what everyone's doing, but we still need to have solutions, and we need to have those there. So I'll just share with you 3 things that I'm doing. The first thing is I own a training company for students seeking careers in investment banking. A core part of our training, we've put 10,000 people through our training program, and about 100,000 people have been through our free training. And they are all the future investment bankers from Oxford, from Cambridge. By the way, when you're saying these evil bankers are just students from London Stock Exchange, London School of Economics, Oxford, Cambridge. They're our children. A lot of the future bankers are the cream of what's supposed to be the cream of our society, the ones that go to the top unis. So we put them through a training program, and a core part of that is to understand sustainability in banking, social banking, and monetary reform. That's a very important part to us. We want to spark a whole next generation of bankers that understand the issues and can make some kind of change from the inside. The second thing we're doing is we're sponsoring positive, we're working to promote Positive Money, who have actually drafted the legislation. They've been making massive progress by having a solution-based focus. I strongly recommend you guys get involved in that, check it out. They've been making massive progress. They got to pitch to, in Parliament recently, the reforms and proposals. The final thing that we're doing is we're creating a business which is, after writing my book on Bank to the Future, I did a whole study of how people could opt out of the banking system. It's not available next year, it comes out next month, so if you look for it on Amazon, it won't be there. But I did a whole study of how, for example, WikiLeaks are getting funded when they've been boycotted from the whole banking system. PayPal boycotted them. Bank of America said we won't support it. Visa said no. MasterCard said no, but they still get paid. Because technological innovation and entrepreneurs are creating a complete alternative system right now. And we're creating an alternative banking system, because what we did is we went and said, I promise you this will create a much more sustainable banking system. They said, we just don't get it, really, were what their words were. I said, if we created a sustainable bank that works at a working model of banking reform using our connections that have set up banks, would you be interested? Would you like to see it? They said, yes, see if you can make it work. So we did. And that's our business, banktothefuture.com. So those are the things that we're doing. My forum happens to be business. Your forum is whatever your forum was. We all need a niche expertise. We all need to make a difference in our own way. But we need to be heard, and banking reform will happen. And by the way, there is a rough ride ahead. There is a depression ahead. But it's a question of, will the government reform before the depression or after the depression? My guess is after. Any questions?